Welcome to BigTent USA. We're so excited for this evening's discussion with Senator Chris Murphy and Lis Smith. At BigTent, we put democracy above partisanship. We're a national women-led voter coalition dedicated to protecting democracy, women's reproductive rights, and our children and our grandchildren's future through education and civic engagement. So tonight we are honored to host two political superstars. Lis Smith has worked on more than 20 political campaigns, including those of Barack Obama, Pete Buttigieg, and most recently, new member of Congress, Tom Suozzi. Lis also found time to write Any Given Tuesday, which gives an entertaining and revealing and very personal look behind the scenes of public life. I loved the book and encourage all of you to read it. Chris Murphy, who represents all of us in the Connecticut branch of BigTent, has spent his time in the U.S. Senate reaching across the aisle to find creative and practical solutions to the biggest issues facing Americans, including gun safety, education, and immigration. Yesterday, a Bloomberg article said, immigration has erupted into a defining issue of the 2024 ballot, with a poll finding it second only to the economy as voters' top concern. It then quoted a Texas rancher and former state lawmaker who said, "This is going to decide who becomes the president, how it's handled." It's because of Senator Murphy's bipartisan work on the border reform agreement and Lis's work helping Rep. Suozzi craft his winning messaging on immigration that we asked the two of them to talk with us today. But of course, the conversation won't be limited to immigration. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. And Lis and Senator Murphy, over to you.
Great. It's so good to be with all of you tonight, Sue. Thank you so much for having us. And Senator Murphy, thank you so much for taking time out of your very busy schedule to talk about this important issue with us. So I spent the last couple of days poring over all of your interviews on immigration and your role in crafting the bipartisan immigration compromise, and came away with a few thoughts. Like, one, it was really stressful reading this because, as Sue just mentioned, while all of this was unfolding in Washington on the super serious Senate level, I was on the ground in New York 3, and it was really sort of the ground zero politically for how this was playing out in the ground on the ground. And so reminded me a lot of that very, very stressful special election. And we will talk more about that in a second. Second thing I took away was, oh my God, I don't think I've ever been so pessimistic before about our ability to get hard things done, to get bipartisan things done. Again, that's something that we are going to take away. And the third thing that I don't say lightly is that after reading all of your interviews, I really, really wish that every Democrat in the country could just like get a 10-minute immigration messaging boot camp. Not just every Democrat, like anyone who wants to get a solution on this, that they could get like a 10-minute communications media prep boot camp with you, because I feel like we would be much more likely to be able to win on this issue and actually get solutions if you were in every Democrat and reform-minded elected officials' ear on this.
Well, that's very kind of you, Lis, and it's great to be with you. Congratulations on the victory in New York 3. Obviously, that was in some ways a validation of our work, given the fact that it sounded like people there were, really focused on getting something done, that they were not interested in letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, which is the death of all good compromise in Washington. So I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yes, indeed. So take us a step back, and this is sort of a broad question. You can address it however you want, but immigration has been an issue in the national debate forever, really, literally in the American debate forever. And tell us what led to this moment, to this crisis, and what forced the bipartisan compromise in the Senate. Like, what was the sort of ignition for that?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, obviously, America from the very beginning, right, has had a struggle with how to stitch together a multicultural, heterogeneous nation. And one of the ways that we have done that is to try as best we can to have clear rules on how you become a member of the club, right? How you become an American. And having a clear set of rules helps us sort of understand who we are and who we aren't. So this issue percolates, it bubbles up every now and again. But it has come to the forefront in the last year because the numbers of people crossing the southwest border are just unprecedented. At the end of last year, we had 10,000 people every single day coming across the southwest border in an unplanned way. America simply cannot handle that number of new people coming into the country without planning, without resources on a daily basis. But it also comes at a really interesting and anxious cultural and economic moment for the country. Folks are feeling really frustrated, really down, economically powerlessness. They feel like they've been waiting in line for the American dream for a long, long time, playing by the rules and not getting what was promised to them. So when they see 10,000 people crossing the border and in effect skipping the line, right, getting to be a part of this American experiment without going through the traditional pathway of receiving a green card or a refugee status, they get angry. And it compounds this sense of frustration and powerlessness that they already have. So it's a really important and very legitimate issue. The problem is, as you know, is that Democrats, found themselves in an unnecessarily defensive crouch on the issue of immigration after 4 years of Trump. And we ended up unnecessarily being far too defensive of the existing system, which makes absolutely no sense that somebody can come into this country with a non-valid asylum claim and get 10 years in this nation, whether or not they qualify. And so the moment that occurred in the fall was an opportunity to find common ground, to correct a very broken border, to try to cobble together some additional rights for people that were already here, for the Democratic Party to kind of get itself right, aligned with the big middle of America that wants a better controlled border, and maybe show the country that even on the toughest political nut to crack, the issue of immigration, we could make progress. Obviously, we were in this room because the Republicans said we're not going to pass Ukraine aid unless you pass immigration aid. But I would immigration reform. But I would argue Democrats should have been in that room no matter what. That even if they weren't conditioning Ukraine aid on the resolution of the border, we should have been forcing a conversation around giving the president more powers to bring the border under control.
Yeah, and you mentioned a number there, 10,000, as many as 10,000 people come across the board. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I look back to some of previous years and, in 2012, when this was a big issue, when I was on Barack Obama's campaign and he was being attacked from both the left and the right on this, it was about 200 people a day, 250 people a day, 500 people a day, nothing like these numbers.
Nothing like these numbers, but just to give a little bit broader historical context, we actually have seen numbers like this in the past. During most of the 1990s, you had easily 10,000 people crossing every day. It's just we had no border patrol. So all those people were crossing without being apprehended. So we've actually had times in American history where this number of people has been crossing, but it is more visible today because we have a much bigger infrastructure on the border so that when you cross, you actually get apprehended and documented. And so the numbers are comparable to the 1990s. It's just, with cable news and social media and a much bigger infrastructure on the border, something that you can't take your eyes off of when the numbers get that high.
Yes. So the Republicans sort of forced this with Israel, Ukraine, but it is a discussion we should have been having regardless. Now you, Senator Kyrsten Sinema from Arizona, Senator James Lankford from Oklahoma end up the lead negotiators on this. And, I mean this only in a positive way, but that group of three of you, it sort of sounds like the setup for a joke, sort of like, the Senate version of the Star Wars cantina scene. So
well, I do take offense to that. So unless I'm Harrison Ford in that analogy.
So I think maybe, who is Harrison Ford in this situation? But so tell us, how did the three of you end up on this? And specifically, how did you, end up here? You are, I don't know, a liberal progressive senator from a blue state. How did you sort of become this go-to bipartisan problem solver for Democrats in the Senate?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I still don't, have a perfect answer. Listen, I think, part of the reason is the 2022 gun bill. So, maybe immigration and guns are the two hottest third rails in American politics, and the fact that I was able to craft a compromise on the issue of guns with Kyrsten Sinema in the room certainly gave me credibility in the Senate on the right and the left, that put me in a position perhaps to be someone that could be trusted on the issue of immigration. But it really all starts back in January of 2023 when James, Kyrsten, and I went to the border together. It was a quiet trip. There were a couple other senators, but we came back and started sort of an off-the-record dialogue about the kind of things that we could eventually find common ground on. None of us knew that there was going to be this opportunity for a much more public negotiation around the national security supplemental, but it was that dialogue that we had started after our trip to the border a year and a half ago that put us in that room. Lankford was kind of appointed by McConnell as their lead negotiator. Nobody in their caucus sort of knows more about the border. He's just a policy expert. Sinema's always in the room for these compromises. You weren't going to be able to keep her out, in part because she's a border state senator. And then I thought it was important to actually have a progressive representing the Democratic Party in the room. I mean, you could have put a sort of moderate Democrat, but I'm not sure that they would have been able to carry as many votes as the bill ended up carrying on the Democratic side. So I thought it was important to have somebody like me that believed in a pathway to citizenship, protecting the Dreamers, to negotiate our side.
So, so take us behind the scenes here. How does a bipartisan bill like this or negotiation like this go down? My understanding is that you guys negotiated every day for 3 to 4 months. Did any of you walk in with like red lines saying this has to be in the bill or we will absolutely not support this? And how did you feel about the bill that ultimately came out of these bipartisan negotiations?
Yeah, I mean, there certainly were red lines. I mean, that's how we got the gun bill done, was we sort of agreed about what we weren't going to talk about. So on the gun bill, we said we're not going to talk about anything the NRA wants. So we're not going to include any wish list from the gun lobby. But we're also not going to talk about assault weapons bans and universal background checks because we know that can't get Republican votes. Here, we weren't willing to talk about a restart of any Trump era policies. So we weren't talking about building the wall. We weren't talking about remain in Mexico, other sort of more in the weeds policies like safe third country. On the other hand, Republicans said, listen, we are not going to include a pathway to citizenship in this bill. And if you want to sit down and talk, we can talk about other rights for immigrant populations, but we're not in this bill going to do a pathway to citizenship. And so we kind of knew from the beginning what we weren't talking about. What made this negotiation different is that Lankford is like an in the weeds negotiator. So these negotiations were torturous because normally you would kind of negotiate the broad agreement in the room and then staff would sort of write the text. That's not what happened here. We wrote not all of the text, but we wrote a good deal of the text in the room with Lankford. The room started small with Lankford, Sinema, and I and our key staff, but then it grew. The administration in December joined, so Secretary Mayorkas was in the room. The secretary himself was there for most every meeting. The president sent his deputy chief of staff to be part of the negotiation, and then Senator Schumer and Senator McConnell sent staff in. So by the time January and February rolled around, we had a very, very big room, which slowed the negotiations down even further. Again, it was a 4-month process before that fateful Sunday night we were finally able to roll out a bill that I think was much bigger and much more comprehensive than most people thought it would be. Had 3 big policies to tighten up the border and had probably 6 or 7 different policies that advanced immigrant rights.
And so what are if you had to just go do like a clip notes, right, of the really key things on there, both in terms of border enforcement and and then in terms of like new personnel, all that, how would you summarize like the really big things in there that you were planning, assuming that this had gotten sort of the normal rollout of a bill, that you were planning to hammer home with people?
Yeah, three key provisions to control the border. And these provisions were so impactful that ultimately it was the downfall of the bill, because it actually would have gotten the border in decent control by the election. Three provisions: $20 billion in additional spending that would be used for new Border Patrol agents, new asylum officers, new infrastructure and hardware on the border, new technology. Second, a reform of the asylum process. Right now, as I mentioned, it takes 10 years for somebody to apply for asylum. Our bill would change that and adjudicate almost all the asylum claims at the border before the person left the border, or at worst, within 6 months of when they arrive in the country. That fundamentally changes the calculation for people coming and crossing, because they're all paying $5,000, $10,000 to traffickers. They're willing to do that if at worst they get 3 or 4 free years in the United States. If they only get a couple weeks or a couple months, they're not going to pay the $5,000 to $10,000 if they don't have a valid asylum claim. So that reform is really important. And then lastly, a new power for the president to shut down the border in between the ports of entry to asylum claims when the numbers get too high, kind of an emergency shutoff authority that couldn't be permanent, but would, obviate these moments when you have 10,000 people crossing every day. Those three changes together would have gotten us from 10,000 people crossing a day down to 1,000, 2,000 people crossing every day, and would have taken this issue off of the front pages, made it much more manageable.
So all of this comes together over the course of 3-4 months, painstaking negotiations, and then the bill text is released in, I think, what was it, end of January or early February. It's endorsed by the Conservative Border Patrol Union, Wall Street Journal editorial board, U.S. Chamber of Commerce, not exactly left-wing organizations and media outlets. But then it just, as quickly as it's introduced, it sort of collapses. And in interviews, you blame this collapse on the MAGA wing of the Republican Party, and said that quote, that their head may tell them that they want to compromise, but their hearts are allergic to solving the problem, which I thought, was a really good quote. So could you walk us through how this fell apart so quickly? Like, from having representatives from Lindsey Graham and Mitch McConnell in the room, and all this sort of anticipation of this, to then just sort of unraveling so quickly.
Yeah, I mean, listen, let me be clear. As much as I wanted to get an immigration deal, I told Republicans from the outset how hard this was going to be. I told them this sounds like a really bad idea to tie Ukraine funding to immigration reform, because don't we all know what's going to happen? If we get a bipartisan agreement, do you really think Donald Trump is going to be for it? And, their answer to me was kind of alternating. One, we'll get him there. Trump will want these new powers. We'll convince him. Or, well, it's just the right thing to do. And even if he's against it, we'll still be for it in the end. Neither of those things turned out to be true. One, Trump and his allies were against it from the beginning, but then they turned up the heat the night the bill came out to an extreme level. And two, Republicans were lying to themselves. They have never been, and are not going to be for the foreseeable future, willing to stand up to Donald Trump. And so when the heat got turned up on Sunday night, they all within 24 hours wilted, like including the Republican senators who were in the room negotiating the bill on Sunday. Lindsey Graham was the last guy we needed to get on board. We negotiated with him personally over that final weekend. Mitch McConnell was part of the negotiating team. Both of them voted against the bill in the end, because Trump made this political calculation that the bill actually would be effective, and that if there were only 1,000 people crossing a day instead of 5,000 people crossing a day, that would hurt his reelection chances. And ultimately, only 4 of them, Langford and a handful of others, voted for the measure when it came before the Senate. And it was heartbreaking, because on Sunday afternoon, we had 20 to 25 Republicans who were either yeses, had personally told us they were voting for it, or we thought legitimately were lean yeses. And Kirsten's, she's a realist. She's not a pie in the sky optimist. She and I both thought on Sunday we could get this thing passed. And on Sunday night at 10 p.m., as I saw this furor sort of combusting online and in conversations I was overhearing happening in Republican offices, I texted her about 10 p.m. that night, and I said, Kirsten, they are going to burn this bill down before the sun comes up tomorrow morning. And that's exactly what Trump and his team did.
And you had this line that I thought it was sort of haunting and extremely depressing, right? You said if Republicans couldn't accept this deal on immigration, there's no deal they're going to accept. And so I'm curious if, with a couple months now since then and having a little more time to process this, you still think that's true? And two, I'm curious, do you think that's just true about immigration, or do you think that's true generally, that bipartisan compromise is not something that is going to be able to happen with Washington Congress and certainly the MAGA Republicans acting the way they are right now?
No, I feel this specifically about the issue of immigration. I'm actually still pretty optimistic about the opportunity, as long as Democrats are controlling both chambers, to be able to get bipartisan compromise, because I just lived through an era of pretty unprecedented bipartisan compromise. I mean, like, people forget that during COVID, we passed 6 different big bipartisan bills that save lives and businesses and colleges and hospitals. Obviously, you've got the gun bill, you've got the infrastructure bill, the veterans bill, go down the list, a pretty wild set of big bipartisan compromises. We hit the wall on immigration, and we hit the wall for a couple of reasons. One, we didn't roll this thing out until the election year, and just that comes with potential pitfalls. But two, this issue of immigration is existential for Trump, right? It is literally what he led his campaign with, right? Is demonizing people coming to this country, blaming all of our ills on immigration. He just can't exist as a candidate. His movement can't exist without this issue unsolved. And so I'm actually not pessimistic under the right conditions to get Republicans and Democrats together on other issues. This one, I think they have just now made clear over and over and over again, by the way, from 2013, when we first had a bipartisan bill that died in a Republican House, to this year, when we had a bipartisan bill that died in the Senate, that they are just not open for business. Republicans right now are not open for business on immigration.
Yeah, there's a point there that you made in there that I'm going to come back to in a second, just about this happening in an election year. But before that, I want to address one thing. We've talked about sort of the Trump tanking this, MAGA Republicans sort of lack of courage and allowing this bill to sort of just dissolve. And I'm not trying to both sides this issue at all. That's absolutely not what I'm trying to do. But I do think it's important that we address some of the criticisms that were on the left and in the Democratic Party about this bill. So, after Tom Suozzi won that election, there were a number of stories that came out with progressive members of Congress saying we shouldn't read too much into this, because Democrats like Tom Suozzi shouldn't try to sound like Republicans and shouldn't act like Republicans to win on immigration. And, that pissed me off to no end, excuse my language, because if we wanted to sound like Republicans on immigration, we would say, we don't want any solutions, tank the bill. But a second criticism I heard was, while I was working on Suozzi's race, I was also senior advisor to Adam Schiff and his Senate race in California. And there was the senior senator from California, and some groups out there who were saying that, ultimately this bill didn't reflect their values, because no Latino senators were pulled into negotiating it, and no border state Democrats were brought into helping negotiate that. So I'm just curious, as Democrats, we don't always just have to deal with criticisms from Republicans and tension with them. We do oftentimes have a lot of criticisms that we have to deal with in our own party. So I'm curious sort of what your response to those criticisms are, and how you think we deal with those internal fissures going forward.
Well, I think it's first important to note that though we were just talking about the provisions in this bill that were relevant to the border, there were a set of really important provisions that were important to immigrant communities. For instance, this bill included the biggest increase in family and work visas in a generation. This bill included, for the first time ever, a right to counsel, to lawyers, for everybody applying for asylum. This bill did have some pathways to citizenship for certain discrete populations. So there were a bunch of really important reforms in this bill for progressive causes. But maybe to take, the two, I think, very valid criticisms you raised, the first being, are we talking like Republicans? Well, I think we're talking like Americans. Like, the fact of the matter is that the broad middle of this country, in between the 10-yard lines, thinks that we should have a much more secure border than we should. And I watched your ads in New York 3. Tom Suozzi's ads, yeah, he's led with conversation about the border, and he might have ended with conversation about the border, but in between, he said we should have a pathway to citizenship for people who are here and living in the shadows. It's just, that's a much more believable and digestible argument if it comes in the context of saying the first priority needs to be to make sure that we have border security. And so I don't think that we're making ourselves sound like the other political party. I just think we're aligning ourselves with where this country is, and frankly, kind of recapturing where the Democratic Party used to be on immigration, where we were for, more immigrant rights, but we are also not wildly to the left of Republicans on border security. And then lastly, Liz, one of the criticisms was, well, this doesn't have a pathway to citizenship, and we aren't going to support any immigration or border reform unless there's a pathway to citizenship. Well, that's been our strategy for 40 freaking years. And it hasn't worked, right? For 40 years, we've said we're not going to do anything on immigration or border until we get a pathway to citizenship. Maybe our strategy would be better if we got a secure border, right? Took that issue off the front pages. And maybe if Americans were confident that the border was secure, they would be more willing to prioritize taking this population of 10+ million people who are in the shadows and giving them a pathway to be citizens of the country. So I just think it was time for us to employ a different strategy than the one that had failed for decades when it came to trying to do the right thing for people in this country.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense to me. And you had this great quote where you said, one party thinks we shouldn't have legal immigration, and then one party seems like they don't care about the border at all and keeping it secure. And then like everyone else is in between. And I'm trying to figure out and get to the people who are in between. And that's certainly something we saw on the ground in New York 3. So now getting to the fun part here, right? Or at least the fun part to me. The beginning here was a little more spinach. This is the ice cream, right? This is okay. How do we operationalize this? Let's talk about the politics of this. And as Sue mentioned, I was on the ground. I was a communications advisor to Tom Suozzi. And I remember when I looked at our first poll after I'd said yes, working on the campaign, I think my mom's watching this right now. I think I called her and was like, oh my God, Mom, I do not know if we can win this race, because immigration was not one of the top issues. It was by far the top issue. But then if you break into the numbers, you look at it, who do voters trust on it? It is certainly not Democrats. So it seemed like, we were not going to be set up for victory here. And then, that's about mid-December, the day after Christmas, Tom Suozzi calls me and says, Liz, you might think this is crazy, but I want my first press conference in the new year to be on immigration. It's the top issue. I want to flip the script. I want to do what Bill Clinton did with welfare. Let us take our biggest issue vulnerability and go on the offense on it. And we're thinking, okay, let's do this. It makes some waves when he does this, right? Because it's not usual for Democrats to do a first press conference like this. But the next week was really where the race really started to be a part of the national debate, because an hour and a half before his Republican opponent is set to do, a press conference outside a center that's housing migrants in Queens, we get wind of it. And so we jump on a call and we decide, you know what, screw it, let's crash this. And we pull it back a little bit and we decide he's going to get there in a car, wait till the opponent leaves, and then get in front of all the cameras and say, I want a deal. Republicans can have some of their wall. They can have some concessions. I want these things. Let's just come together. Let's finally solve this. And, it's one of those moments where it's sort of meta, because you're planning this out. What's he going to say? How's he going to respond? But in the back of my head, I was thinking, you know what? This could be a really big moment in the campaign. One, this could be seen as overreach, desperate, and tank his campaign because we're playing too much on the opponent's playing field. Or this could actually be the beginning of a playbook for how Democrats win on this issue. And sure enough, it became the latter, right? So she refuses to get into any specifics, refuses to endorse a bipartisan deal. He goes, does all that, endorses a deal, says stuff that, and some of that stuff, again, bothers the left, saying, you know what, have some of the wall. I don't care. I just want a deal. And soon then you start seeing CNN, national outlets saying, okay, wow, Democrat did this, maybe we could do it. It also made great TV. You have to deal with the New York media market too. So obviously all the New York TV stations went nuts with this. Sometimes stunts do work. Then, flash forward a couple weeks, it's the week before the election. I get those calls, these calls, Senator, you've certainly gotten them. There's, bedwetting calls from people who are like, well, Liz, I just think you spent a little too much time in this race talking about immigration. You should have just been talking about abortion the whole time. You really played too much on their turf. And then you get the calls from reporters saying, I'm hearing from my sources that you guys did this. And how are you dealing with the second guessing? Then, of course, Tom Suozzi goes on not only to win the race, but he won by 8 points, which no polling had caught. And the race is called at 10:30 that night. First thing I see in the morning is I wake up at 7:30 a.m. and I see that you have put out a memo saying that Democrats everywhere should do what Tom Suozzi did, adopt this model, flip the script, go on the offensive. So first of all, as I noted, this race is not called until 10:30. So I'm envisioning, were you at your computer, downing a Red Bull, cranking this thing out, or was it in the can already?
I think it was in the can already, but because I had become convinced this is part of the reason I was in the room, right, was because I was deeply frustrated that our party had gotten so far out of step with the vast middle of the country that wants a more secure border. And so I'm unapologetic in the fact that a small part of the reason why I was in this room was to try to sort of drag the political center of my party towards the political center of the country without abandoning our belief in the rights of immigrants or an ability for people to get on a pathway, or in robust immigration reform. But yes, listen, I think we're not playing on, and I assume this is why you made this decision, we're not playing on Republicans' territory. Voters have made this decision, right? Whether we like it or not. This is not just a number 1 or number 2 issue in New York 3. This is a number 1 or number 2 issue everywhere in this country. And in 2020, Joe Biden won by a minuscule amount. And on the 2 top issues in that election, COVID and the economy, he was favored over Donald Trump, not by a lot, but by 2 or 3 points. In this election, the 2 most important issues everywhere, the economy and immigration. Economy, depending on how you ask the question, they're neck and neck. On immigration, Biden is underwater by 15 to 20 points. You can't win a general election if on one of the 2 most critical issues to voters, you have that big a deficit. And the genius is what you did in New York 3 is replicable, right? Polling tells us that voters are very willing to believe the truth. They've always been a little skeptical that Republicans actually care about immigration because they talk about it all the time, but whenever they get power, they never do anything about it. And so when you tell them, we got the toughest bipartisan border deal in the history of the country, and Donald Trump told Republicans to kill it because he thought it was good politics to keep the border a mess. Swing voters are like, oh yeah, that makes sense. That sounds like Donald Trump. And then when you tell them the specifics of the bill, which are really easy to understand, for instance, being able to close the border when crossings get too high, they understand it pretty quickly as well. So I know it's very uncomfortable for Democrats to talk about an issue that doesn't always feel core to us, border security. I know it feels like this is a Republican issue, but it isn't. It is one of the key issues that is going to determine who wins this election. And if we aren't talking about it, we're losing. And we have been gifted with a way to talk about it that we didn't have prior to the debacle of this bill. And so there's a silver lining on this failure. It's not a thin silver lining because it may actually end up helping to get Joe Biden reelected as president of the United States if we take advantage of the opportunity.
Yeah, and that's a point that you hit on before that I sort of wanted to go back to. you said that, you know, maybe it was a mistake to bring this up in an election year because the Republicans wouldn't go along with it. And, you know, I do think the Republicans take this bill because they thought it would be good for them politically. But do you think that this is actually that they were thinking about this the wrong way and that this will backfire on them politically? It did in New York 3, but do you think that it has the potential to backfire on them come November?
I think the jury is still out, Liz, because it's up to us. I mean, I will tell you, I am worried that we are not going to tell this story. We told it for a week or so after I sent out this memo. I did a bunch of calls with legislative leaders, but Tom and me and a couple others are the only ones that are still consistently telling a story. Gretchen Whitmer was actually on TV last night doing a really good job of making this point. So it's a mistake, a political mistake for Republicans, only if we make it a mistake. But if we think that we can get away with just kind of zipping our lips on immigration and hoping that nobody cares about it and that we'll just move everybody to choice or democracy, I just think that that's a big mistake. So jury's still out, I think, is the answer.
Yeah, well, I've got an idea. I'm just gonna throw this out. Let's brainstorm here. But I actually heard from Tom today that one thing that he wants to do is, if the Democrats will have him, is to go to the Republican convention this summer and just be there to talk about and throw in their faces, MAGA Republicans' faces, right? The Donald Trump's face, that it was them that killed the border deal, right? And that as much as they're going to talk about it, he wants to remind people that they did that. And I feel like that's a good idea. That's something that people who understand this issue and how to communicate on it would be really good at. But, that idea aside, how do we take this whole thing, it was a DC debate, yes, but it touched on the number one issue. How do we go out and make this an issue and remind voters of this so they don't forget about it come November? At this time, 4 years ago, COVID had just hit. We thought maybe it would be gone in like a month or two. And so you can't really anticipate what's going to come up in the news cycle or in the political debate, in the political discourse. But if you were calling the shots and telling every Democrat or every reform-minded person across the country how we're able to keep this in the news, what would your advice be?
Well, as you know, every candidate makes a decision. What are their 2, 3, maybe 4 issues that they're going to talk about? I think this has to be on the list. I mean, I think Democrats need to be talking about, cost of living, the economic difference between, Republicans who want to help billionaires and Democrats who want to help regular people. You got to talk about choice, and you got to talk about immigration. You got to talk about 2 issues that are on our playing field, 1 issue that's on theirs. Everybody may have another one that they want to put in the mix, democracy, for instance. But I think every candidate has to make the courageous decision to talk about this in their stump speech. Second, we need to use the levers that we have in Washington to make sure this stays as a front of mind issue. So that means taking the bill and bringing it back up on the Senate floor and forcing Republicans to vote again against it. That means high-profile Democrats, from the president to Senator Schumer to Hakeem, going to the border, right? That's something that Republicans do. And it signals to the country, whether it's right or wrong, that Republicans care about the border because they're there all the time. Well, Democrats need to go to the border right now and talk about how this wouldn't look as it does if Republicans had passed that bill. I think every candidate's got to make a decision. Democratic leaders have to make some prioritization decisions here. But I acknowledge it's going to be hard because it is not as comfortable a topic for us to talk about as some of these other well-worn Democratic priorities. It's a new bill. It does, as you mentioned, draw some ire from the left. But I just don't think we have any choice.
Liz and Senator Murphy, thank you so much. This has been an incredible conversation, and we have a very active chat, and we got some great questions ahead of time. So in our last 12 minutes, I'd like to get to some of these. And I wanted to start with, there's a piece in Axios that Amy Birnbaum put in that Wisconsin swing voters largely blame Republicans, and specifically Donald Trump, for Congress's failure to pass bipartisan legislation to improve border security. So this is a stat that she's brought to us. And I think the question for both of you, given what I've seen in the chat and also reading in the news, is there an opportunity to talk about what immigrants bring to this country to make it, instead of it being a negative impact on America, that there's a positive impact on America? A lot of people in the chat reference the fact that, immigrants, go into the fields, they work in our hospitals, they work in our older care homes. The men who died on the bridge in Baltimore, the Francis Scott Key Bridge, were all from Mexico and Central America. And is there a way to change the narrative a little bit, talking about border security, but also talking about how we are enriched by the people who come to America, who want to get in line for the dream, as you mentioned, Senator Murphy? So can we sort of parse that out a little bit and talk about, is there a potential to do both for the pro-democracy coalition?
Well, let me take a quick stab at it, and then I'd love to hear about what Liz did and what Tom did in New York 3. I referenced, some of the way that he talked about it, right? But listen, I think this is why this is such an opportunity for us, because again, the vast majority of Americans are very proud of the fact that this country is a nation of immigration, and they support robust legal immigration, right? They actually don't buy this argument from Trump that we should shut down the border. They broadly don't buy the idea that every immigrant is a safety threat to the country. And so they want to be with us on the issue of immigration. But when they don't hear us talking about border security, they are reluctant, right? Because they only think we're talking about sort of half the issue, right? Half the issue is robust legal immigration. Half the issue is doing it in a planful way. And so this is why this is such an opportunity for us, because we don't and we shouldn't just talk about border security. We should talk about the fact that we have a huge labor need in this country. And the way that you fill it is by allowing more people here legally. We should talk about the story of American greatness, right? We are all, most of us here because of America's history of immigration. I just think if you marry that together with tougher talk on the border, you have an easy winning message. Republicans will never have a winning message because they are not prepared to talk about the benefits of immigration. They are only prepared to talk about the threat of immigration. And while people don't like the way that the border looks today, they do not want to fully close it. So that's why the opportunity absolutely exists for us.
Yeah, and just to add, and this is something I know that the senator has said before, is that you should talk about those things, and you should talk about the economic benefits that immigrants bring to this country, their contributions, but you cannot have that conversation until you first establish credibility with voters. And how you establish credibility is you acknowledge that what is happening at the border is a problem. It's a crisis. And you acknowledge that their feelings on this are real. And here in New York, right, I'm here in New York City, but we had 2 elections in a row that sort of, where you saw different tactics from the Democrats and different outcomes. 2022, the top issue for voters across the board was crime. And rather than taking it on head on and Democrats saying, okay, I understand this is a problem, this is how I address it, they just sort of said, it's all in your head. The crime rate's not like what it was in the 90s. This is all an invention of the New York Post and Rupert Murdoch. Well, because of that approach, Democrats in New York were hit by a red wave, right? Because the voters thought that we were tone deaf. We weren't listening to them. And we had no credibility with them because we were telling them that all of their fears, all of their concerns weren't real. Flash forward to Tom Suozzi's race in February of this year. He took the opposite approach. The first thing he did when talking about immigration wasn't to say, oh, this is a Fox News thing. This is a New York Post thing. It's all in your head. Migrants don't actually, cause any problems in your life. He said, I understand where you're coming from. I understand your frustrations here. And you know what? What's happening at our border is a disgrace. Once he said those few things, he could then pivot to talking about all of the things that immigrants could do for, Long Island and Queens, all the things that they have done, all the things they could do. But he did not have credibility to talk about those things until he first established that he understood the problem that we had on our border, and that he would first take solutions to address the border. And I know that's something the senator said before, but it's a really important thing, not just on issues like border and crime, but across the board. We need to meet voters where they are and acknowledge that their concerns are real.
Such a good point. There is some concern we all have concern about, it sounds like Senator Murphy, we're not gonna see this reform in 2024. So of course, the Biden administration, I think, Liz, when we had our prep call, I think the first thing Mike Johnson said is the reason he didn't support this bill is that President Biden could actually close the border right now unilaterally, like he had that power. So can you tell us, Senator Murphy, about, is that true? Can he close the border right now? And how do we sort of combat that message? Because that seemed to be like the talking point about why they rejected the hard work that you and Sinema and Langford had done for so many months on end. And again, thank you for that.
Yeah, I mean, the short story is it is not true. It's a lie. President does not have the legal authority to close the border. Donald Trump tried that in his first term, and he was immediately enjoined by the courts because it's illegal and unconstitutional. President doesn't have that ability. And Republicans didn't believe that the president could do this on their own when they were sworn into office, because the second bill they introduced, H.R. 2, was a bill giving the president all sorts of new necessary authorities to control the border. So Republicans, up until the point where we achieved a bipartisan compromise, thought that you needed to pass legislation to control the border. As soon as they were presented with a bill that was going to do it, that was on the precipice of passage, they changed their tune 180 degrees and decided, the president actually has the power to do it. He doesn't. It's just absolutely made up. The president cannot invent new resources at the border. He cannot close the border. He does not have the legal authority to handle this problem without additional money and without additional resources.
Okay, so Liz, in your expertise, like, how would you message that to voters? That I'm sorry, Mike Johnson, thanks for trying to deflect why you're tanking this bipartisan legislation. Like, if you were speaking to a candidate about this specific incident, like, what would you say to them? This is what you do. This is what you say.
Sorry, which specific incident? Just
the fact that Mike Johnson, his reasoning for not bringing this legislation to a vote was, oh, Joe Biden could do this right now. We don't need this.
Oh, yeah.
Legislation.
I think that some of us follow that stuff super closely. I think most people tune out this sort of executive power versus legislative power, all of that.
Totally.
This is a pretty simple thing. Democrats, a bipartisan group came to the table with a bipartisan compromise that would have been the most significant immigration reform in 40 years. Donald Trump and MAGA Republicans tanked it because they think it will help them politically. They want chaos at the border. Democrats and some like-minded independent Republican folks, they want order at the border. They want a compromise. And so that's a political argument I would make.
There it is, right there in the box. That's the genius of this. It's that simple. I mean, Liz does it
So
better than me.
simple. Yeah.
It's so simple. It's simple, it's easy to understand, and it's believable.
Right. And that's the thing is, just generally I find with political arguments and with what the Republicans try to do now is they try to get Democrats to run down all these rabbit holes, debate us on executive authority. Why isn't he doing this? Why isn't he doing that? The simpler we can make arguments and talk about things not in Washington speak, not in legislative speak, the better. And this is so common sense. And I think the simpler we make it, the better.
Okay, so another question that's come up also in the chat is it is it worth the pro-democracy side to talk about the plans of Project 2025, a Trump 2.0, expelling, deporting, jailing immigrants? How does that work into this idea of talking about immigration as we get closer and closer to the election? Who wants to take that one? Senator Murphy?
Yeah, I mean, again, interested in Liz's thoughts on this. Again, I guess I defer to her previous point, which is our hurdle here is that voters don't know what happened, right? I mean, voters right now, most voters don't know that there was a bipartisan immigration reform bill, don't know that Donald Trump killed it. You are right that for those that do know about it, they think that Republicans are to blame because they've heard something about that, right? And when you tell them the story, and this is a recent poll I just looked at, the Republican advantage on this issue, which is somewhere close to 20 points, just evaporates. So it works quickly. So, I mean, it's not irrelevant to talk about sort of Trump's dystopian plan for this country in which he's going to round up immigrants and ship them out of the country. But I think that we have so much work to do to just tell the key story of the fact that we could have fixed the problem and Republicans chose not to fix the problem because they're not interested in fixing the problem, that we probably shouldn't get distracted.
I have nothing to add.
Okay, well, that's really helpful. Senator Murphy, on another note, I just want to take the last minute because, of course, we're all very concerned about the war in Ukraine, the people of Ukraine. Can you tell us if we are going to see a bill on the floor of the House? Anyways, would love to hear your thoughts on this and if there's anything that we can do in the BigTent community to, try to make this issue top of mind for more Americans.
Well, I mentioned, the political silver lining of the immigration and border debate, but there was a policy silver lining. Republicans said that they would only, in the Senate, Republicans said, we'll only vote for Ukraine funding unless you do immigration reform. Well, we gave them a really meaty immigration reform bill. They killed it. And having confronted the fact that they are actually not for immigration reform as they had requested, they were then shamed into voting for Ukraine aid by itself, Ukraine, Israel, and humanitarian funding. So we passed with 70 votes, a very good bipartisan majority, Ukraine, Israel, and humanitarian funding, which has had the effect of ramping up the pressure on the House of Representatives. And so you've heard Mike Johnson sort of starting to tease out some different options for bringing Ukraine bill to the floor. They don't sound like great ideas. He's apparently going to put some energy reform package together with Ukraine aid, but he's searching, right? I think he realizes, my hope is that he realizes, my guess is that he realizes that doing nothing is not an option. And so it may take a bunch of trial and error in April for him to figure out the path forward on Ukraine aid, because he's going to have to get Democratic votes, right? There's just a portion of his caucus that's going to vote no on Ukraine aid, so he's going to have to get some Democratic votes. But my hope is that he's beginning that process of trying to find that path forward. And I don't think that he would be in that process if it wasn't for the 70-vote majority in the Senate, and we wouldn't have gotten the 70-vote majority in the Senate had I and others not spent 4 months of our life trying to construct what ultimately was a fruitless compromise on immigration.
Yes. And so does it matter calling your senator, like calling your representative? Is that like a power that the American people have? Does it really matter, Senator Murphy?
Always matters. Always matters. Okay. So I describe it as, when the level of volume goes up in Washington on any issue, you feel it. You feel it, right? Because staffers talk to each other. When the calls start coming in at a higher pitch on an issue, there's just a buzz, right? I felt it when the Republicans were trying to kill the ACA back in 2017. We're feeling it now on on the issue of Ukraine. So, I know it often feels, a little lonely to make that one phone call, to write that one email. But there is something that happens in this business when there is when there is sort of a resounding volume increase on a particular issue. It does move the place to action. And I just know that Johnson wouldn't be even teasing out these plans if he and his members weren't feeling continuous heat from constituents and from interest groups on getting Ukraine aid done.
All right. Well, thank you. I really appreciate that insight, because I think we all feel slightly isolated and, wondering what to do about this. So Liz and Senator Murphy, thank you so much for coming to Big Tent. This was an incredible conversation. We're so grateful to both of you. And I want everyone to know that Liz's son, who's a baby, has a fever, and she came here to be with us, which is amazing. He's 6 months old, and that is a real gift. We really appreciate it. And we hope you'll come back to Big Tent. Senator Murphy, thank you for all your work on gun safety and immigration and everything that you do for the American people and the people of Connecticut. And everyone, hope to see you at Big Tent next week for Liz Cheney. Everyone have a great night. Thank you again for coming to Big Tent.
Thank you. It was so fun doing this.
Thanks, Liz.
Good night,
Thanks.
everyone.
Bye.